For 600 years, a single family ruled half of Europe, and they did it without being especially good at fighting. They lost battles constantly. Their armies were often outnumbered, outmatched, and out of money. And yet, the map kept filling up with their colors. Spain, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, chunks of Italy, the entire New World. Not because they conquered it, because they married into it. This was a dynasty that discovered you could inherit a continent if you were patient enough, lucky enough, and willing to keep it all in the family. And then, in the space of about 4 years, it was gone. An empire of more than 50 million people, one of the largest states on the entire continent, simply came apart at the seams. And almost nobody drew a sword to save it. No last stand, no heroic siege. It just dissolved. The way a sandcastle dissolves when the tide finally reaches it. 6 centuries of accumulation, undone in less time than it takes to finish a university degree. How something is built and how it dies almost never match. This family spent hundreds of years assembling the most improbable empire in European history through the most peaceful weapon imaginable, a signature on a marriage contract. And it fell apart because of an idea nobody in the 15th century had even invented yet. If you enjoy history told this way, the long, strange machinery of how power actually works, take a second to subscribe and hit like, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. The Habsburgs did not begin as kings. They did not begin as anything close to kings. They began as a small mountain family sitting on a modest stone castle in what is today northern Switzerland, a fortress called Habsburg, from which they eventually took their name. If you had traveled through that region 800 years ago and asked a local who the great powers were, this family would not have made the list. They were counts, middling nobles, the kind of family that owned some land, collected some tolls, quarreled with their neighbors, and would ordinarily be a footnote, a name in a dusty regional record, and nothing more. Imagine the political map of medieval Central Europe as a crowded, chaotic marketplace. Hundreds of little stalls, each one a duke or a count or a bishop, all shouting, all jostling, all defending a few square miles of territory. There was no Germany, no unified nation. There was instead a sprawling, ramshackle thing called the Holy Roman Empire, which, as people love to point out, was famously none of those 3 things. It was not holy, it was not Roman, and it was barely an empire. It was a loose confederation of hundreds of territories stretching across the heart of Europe, and at the top sat an emperor who was not born into the job, but elected to it by a handful of the most powerful princes. Think of it less like a kingdom and more like a fractious committee that occasionally agreed to have a chairman. And in the late 13th century, that committee had a problem. For years, there had been no strong emperor at all, a stretch historians call the Great Interregnum, a leaderless gap where the throne sat effectively empty and the whole system drifted. The powerful princes who did the electing had grown comfortable with that emptiness. A weak or absent emperor meant they could do as they pleased. So when they finally gathered to choose someone, they were not looking for a giant, they were looking for the opposite. They wanted a placeholder, someone modest enough that he'd never threaten them, someone they could control. They found Rudolph, a count of middling rank, already in his mid-50s, which in that century was practically ancient. He had no vast army, no glittering treasury, no fearsome reputation. He was, on paper, exactly the harmless nobody the great princes were hoping for. And that is the delicious irony at the root of this entire 600-year story. The electors chose this man precisely because they were certain he would amount to nothing. They could not have been more wrong. Rudolph turned out to be shrewd, tireless, and completely unsentimental about how power actually worked. Almost immediately, he picked a fight with the strongest man in the region, the King of Bohemia, who controlled a great swathe of territory, including the rich duchies of Austria and Styria to the southeast. This Bohemian king had refused to even acknowledge Rudolph's selection, dismissing him as a jumped-up count. The two of them settled it the old-fashioned way, on a battlefield near Vienna, and Rudolph won. The Bohemian king died in the fighting. Now pay attention to what Rudolph did next, because this is the single move that launched the entire dynasty. He took those conquered Austrian lands, Austria, Styria, the territory around Vienna, and instead of governing them as an emperor holding them in trust, he handed them to his own sons. He made them the family's personal, hereditary property. In one stroke, a wandering mountain family from Switzerland planted its flag in the fertile Danube Valley and never let go. For the next 640 years, wherever the world thought of this family, it thought of them as the lords of Austria. That windfall, a battlefield accident, a rival's sudden death, a shrewd old count seizing the moment, was the seed. Everything else grew from it. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because the family that emerged from Rudolph's gamble did not go on to become the great conquerors of Europe. They tried the conquering route, on and off, and it rarely worked out. Their neighbors were tough, their armies were expensive, and war in that age was a spectacular way to go bankrupt. Consider the arithmetic of medieval warfare for a moment. To raise an army, a king had to hire mercenaries, feed them, arm them, and pay them in hard coin. And the instant the money ran out, those same soldiers would happily switch sides, or simply wander off. A single failed campaign could empty a treasury that had taken a generation to fill. War was like setting fire to a barn full of gold in the hope of roasting one chicken. Sometimes you got the chicken. Usually, you just lost the barn. So, over the generations, the family stumbled onto a different weapon entirely, one that cost almost nothing and could, with enough patience, deliver more than any army ever could. Not the sword, the wedding ring. The logic was almost embarrassingly simple, but almost nobody exploited it as ruthlessly as this family. In that world, land, titles, and crowns passed through bloodlines. Marry your son to a duke's only daughter, and if that duke happened to die without a male heir, which in an age of plague, war, and appalling medicine happened constantly, the inheritance flowed into your family through the marriage. A well-chosen bride was not a romance. She was a legal claim wearing a wedding gown. And a legal claim, unlike an army, did not need to be fed, did not desert, and did not bankrupt you when it rained. There is a line, repeated for centuries and stitched into the family's own mythology, that captures the whole strategy. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. The verse is almost certainly a later invention, polished up long after the fact, so don't picture some medieval Habsburg reciting it as policy. But like all good legends, it stuck because it described something true. While the kings of France and England were mortgaging their kingdoms to pay for battlefields soaked in blood, this family sat in Vienna, quietly signing contracts, arranging betrothals, and waiting. Waiting for the right heiress. Waiting for the right death. Playing a game measured not in seasons, but in generations. And the extraordinary thing is how well it worked. Picture a card player who almost never bets big, who folds most hands, who simply stays at the table decade after decade, while flashier gamblers ruin themselves around him, and who, every so often, is dealt a hand so absurdly good it reshapes the entire game. That was the Habsburg method. They didn't need to win every hand. They needed to survive, stay in the game, and be holding a marriage contract when someone else's family line ran dry. Which brings us to the single most consequential wedding in European history. A marriage so lucrative that it turned the respectable regional dynasty into a world power almost overnight. In the late 15th century, the richest, most glittering territory in all of Europe was not France and not England. It was Burgundy. But not the modern French wine region you might picture. This was a sprawling, fabulously wealthy state that included the Low Countries, the region we now call the Netherlands, and Belgium, packed with the busiest trading cities on the continent. Its cloth towns and ports generated staggering amounts of money. Its ruling duke lived in a court so lavish it made other European monarchs look shabby. If medieval Europe had a Silicon Valley, a place where the wealth was almost obscene and everyone else looked on with envy, Burgundy was it. And the man who ruled it, the last great Duke of Burgundy, was ambitious, reckless, and hungry for a crown to match his fortune. He gambled everything on war, exactly the trap this story keeps returning to. He threw his magnificent army against the tough, unglamorous soldiers of the Swiss cantons, and he lost, catastrophically, again and again. In the last of those battles, in the dead of winter, his army was shattered, and the great Duke himself vanished in the chaos. His body was found days later in a frozen ditch, half eaten by wolves, so mangled it had to be identified by his fingernails and old battle scars. The richest man in Europe, reduced to a frozen corpse in a marsh. Nothing in this story warns against gambling everything on the battlefield more starkly than that image. He left behind a single child, a daughter barely out of her teens, who now inherited the wealthiest lands on the continent, and instantly became the most sought-after bride in the world. Every royal house in Europe wanted her, because whoever married her would absorb Burgundy's staggering wealth. The King of France was circling like a shark, his armies already carving into her territory, fully intending to take her lands by force, one way or another. Into this desperate moment stepped a young Habsburg prince, the son of the reigning emperor. There was no time for a long, careful courtship. The proxy arrangements had been made in advance, and when the young man reached her court, the marriage was sealed with the urgency of a rescue. And here is the part that makes this more than a dynastic transaction. By the accounts that survive, this was not a cold match. The two of them appear to have been genuinely, deeply attached. He was young, he was athletic, he was besotted. For a family whose entire strategy was to treat marriage as cold arithmetic, it's a strangely human moment. A real affection blooming at the exact hinge point where the family's fortunes swung open. And then, the arithmetic did what it always did. Because a few years into the marriage, out riding, she was thrown from her horse. She was pregnant, and the fall was severe. She lingered for weeks, and then died, still in her mid-20s. A single accident, a single fall, on an ordinary day of hunting. Sit with what that death meant. Her young Habsburg widower now held all of it. The Low Countries, the immense Burgundian wealth, the trading cities, the claim to it all, on behalf of their infant son. One wedding had opened the door. One early death had locked the family inside. In a matter of a few years, a dynasty of Austrian dukes had become the guardians of the richest lands in Europe, and they had not won a single battle to do it. They had signed a contract and buried a wife. That was the pattern that would define everything to come. A marriage that swallows a fortune, a death that seals the deal, and a family that keeps drawing the impossible hand. But the truly staggering part hadn't happened yet. Because that infant son, the child of that whirlwind marriage and that fatal fall, would grow up and marry into Spain. And when the deaths piled up on the other side of that match, heir after heir dropping away in a single grim decade, the crowns would come raining down onto the head of one teenage boy, until he held more of the world in his hands than any European ruler had ever touched. The boy's name was Charles, and by the time he was old enough to grow a beard, he had inherited more of the world than any European had ever held at once. Follow the chain of deaths that put it there, because it reads like something no gambler would dare invent. From his father's side came Austria and the Burgundian inheritance, the Low Countries, all that trading wealth. From his mother's side came Spain, which had just been welded together into a single kingdom and had just, by pure timing, stumbled into the largest windfall in human history: the Americas. And every heir who stood between Charles and these crowns obligingly died. A brother-in-law here, a cousin there, his own father dead young. Each death slid another crown down the pole toward the same small head. So picture the map when the pieces finally settled. Charles ruled Spain, and everything Spain was busy conquering across the ocean: Mexico, Peru, the Silver Mountains, territory so vast that no one at the court in Madrid could have described its true extent. He ruled the Low Countries, the richest urban heartland in Europe. He ruled great stretches of Italy, including Naples, Sicily, and Milan. He ruled the ancestral Austrian lands, and on top of all of it, the electors handed him the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, making him the nominal overlord of the German-speaking heart of the continent. It was the empire on which, people began to say, the sun never set, because somewhere in his domains, from the fishing villages of the Netherlands to the mines of the Andes, it was always daytime. Now translate that into something you can feel. Imagine a single manager today responsible for operations on 4 separate continents in a dozen languages, with the fastest communication being a letter carried by a man on a horse, then a man on a ship, then another man on another horse. A message that might take months to cross his own empire and months more for the answer to return. A rebellion could break out in Spain, burn for half a year, and be half over before Charles even heard it had started. He was trying to run a global corporation with the communications technology of the Bronze Age. The empire was not really one thing. It was a scattered heap of unrelated territories, each with its own laws, its own language, its own grievances, held together by nothing except the accident that they all owed allegiance to the same exhausted man. And exhausted is the right word, because Charles spent his entire reign in motion. He did not have a capital. He could not afford one. He was forever on the road, putting down a revolt in one province, fighting the French in Italy, negotiating with rebellious German princes, defending the Mediterranean against the Ottoman fleet, then rushing back across the mountains to deal with the next crisis. By his own later accounting, he crossed the Mediterranean and the open sea many times over, and spent years of his life literally traveling. He was a king with no home, chasing fires around a continent that was always, somewhere, on fire. There was one problem he never solved, and it broke him in the end. The German lands were tearing themselves apart over religion. The great split we call the Reformation had erupted, and half the German princes had broken with Rome. Charles, a devout Catholic to his bones, spent decades trying to force the empire back together by faith. He won battles, he captured his enemies, and it changed nothing. Because you cannot win a war against an idea by capturing the men who hold it. Every time he thought he had crushed the Protestant princes, the idea simply resurfaced somewhere else, in someone else. He was fighting fog. Remember that image. A ruler discovering that an idea in people's heads cannot be defeated by armies, because it is going to come back at the very end of this story, in a form Charles could never have imagined. By his mid-50s, Charles was a physical wreck. He was crippled by gout so severe that in his final campaigns he had to be carried in a litter, his hands and feet swollen and useless. He was worn down, disillusioned, watching the religious unity he had fought his whole life for collapse anyway. And then he did something no emperor of that scale had ever voluntarily done. He quit. In a series of solemn ceremonies in Brussels, leaning on the shoulder of a young nobleman because he could barely stand, Charles formally handed over his empire. He split it in two. His son got Spain, the Americas, Italy, and the Low Countries. His brother got Austria and the imperial title in Germany. And then Charles, the man who had ruled more of the earth than anyone alive, retired to a modest set of rooms attached to a monastery in the Spanish countryside, tucked into the hills. He brought his gout, his books, and a collection of clocks that he tinkered with obsessively. Some accounts say he grew fascinated with trying to get all his clocks to keep perfect time together, and never could. A small, poignant echo of a man who had spent 40 years trying and failing to bring a scattered world into a single rhythm. Whether that detail is literally true or a story polished up later, historians debate, but it's too fitting not to sit with. He died there a couple of years afterward, an old man among his clocks, having given away half the world because holding it had simply become unbearable. That split, Spain to one branch, Austria to the other, is the fork in the road for everything that follows. And the Spanish branch, the richer and grander of the two, made a fateful decision about how to keep its treasure safe. It decided to keep the family blood inside the family. This is where the story turns from grand to grotesque. To prevent their empire from ever again being split up or married away to outsiders, the Spanish Habsburgs began marrying each other. Not distant relations, close ones. Uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin. Over and over, generation after generation, for a century and a half. The idea, in cold dynastic terms, made a kind of sense. If you only marry your own family, no foreign prince can ever inherit your crown. You keep the whole fortune sealed inside one bloodline, like money locked in a vault. But a bloodline is not a vault. It's a living thing, and when you fold it back onto itself again and again, the damage accumulates. Think of it like photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy. Each generation reproduced from an increasingly narrow set of the same worn-out originals, the flaws deepening with every pass, until the image barely resembles a face at all. Modern geneticists have actually gone back and calculated the inbreeding across the Spanish Habsburg line, and the numbers are staggering. By the end, the family's last king was so inbred that, genetically speaking, his parents might as well have been full siblings, even though on paper they were uncle and niece. You can watch the decline happen in their own portraits, which is the eerie part. The court painters recorded it faithfully across the generations, the family's jaw growing longer, heavier, more misshapen, the lower jaw jutting out so far past the upper that the mouth would not properly close. It became so characteristic, it got its name from them, the Habsburg jaw. Look at the royal portraits in sequence, like frames of a slow-motion collapse, and you can see a proud, sharp-featured dynasty melting, decade by decade, into something soft and broken. And it all ended in one man. The last Spanish Habsburg king was the human wreckage of 150 years of this. By the accounts of those who saw him, his jaw was so deformed he could barely chew his own food. He did not speak until he was well into childhood, could barely walk until much later, was plagued by seizures and constant illness, and was, by every description, physically and intellectually devastated. His own contemporaries, with the brutal frankness of the age, took to calling him the Bewitched, because they genuinely could not understand how a man could be so broken except by some curse laid upon him. They did not have the concept of genetics. They only had the evidence in front of them. A king who was the living end of a family that had married itself to death. He could not produce an heir. Of course he couldn't. His body was barely holding itself together, let alone capable of continuing the line. And so for years, all of Europe simply stood around waiting for him to die, openly negotiating who would carve up the vast Spanish Empire the moment his heart stopped. Ambassadors wrote home about the state of his health, the way traders watch a dying company's stock. When he finally died, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, childless, at the tail end of the 17th century, his death set off a continent-wide war over the scraps. A war that dragged in every great power in Europe. The dynasty's greatest strategy, marrying to keep the treasure in the family, had in the end literally consumed the family that held it. There is a dark, perfect symmetry in that. The marriage machine that built the empire eventually married one of its branches straight out of existence. But remember, the family had split in two. The Spanish branch had just burned itself out. The Austrian branch, the one that got the eastern lands and the German imperial crown, was still very much alive. And they were about to reinvent the entire dynasty from the ground up. Because while Spain had been slowly poisoning its own bloodline, the Austrian Habsburgs in Vienna had been facing a threat that made inbreeding look like a minor inconvenience. From the east, the Ottoman Empire, the great power of the age, larger and richer than anything in Christian Europe, had been pushing steadily up through the Balkans and into Hungary. And twice, roughly a century and a half apart, an enormous Ottoman army marched all the way to the walls of Vienna itself and laid siege to the Habsburg capital. Stand on those walls during the second and more famous siege in the late 17th century. Below you stretches an Ottoman army so vast, well over 100,000 men by most estimates, that its tents cover the fields to the horizon like a second city grown up overnight. They have been digging tunnels under your walls for weeks, packing them with gunpowder, blowing holes in the defenses one thunderous blast at a time. The city inside is starving, disease is spreading, the defenders are down to a fraction of their strength. Everyone on those walls understands that if Vienna falls, the road into the heart of Europe lies open. This is not a border skirmish. This is the hinge of a continent. And at the last possible moment, with the walls crumbling, a relief army came over the hills to the west. A combined Christian force led into battle by the King of Poland. What followed was one of the largest cavalry charges in the history of warfare. Thousands of armored Polish horsemen thundering down the slopes into the flank of the exhausted Ottoman lines. The siege broke. The Ottoman army shattered and fled, abandoning its tents, its cannon, and its supplies. It was the high watermark of Ottoman power in Europe, the farthest wave up the beach. And from that day, the tide began to roll back the other way. Now watch what the Vienna Habsburgs did with that victory, because it transformed them. As the Ottomans retreated, the Austrian Habsburgs surged eastward and southward, conquering and absorbing enormous territories, the whole of Hungary, Transylvania, and beyond. In a few decades, they went from being cornered defenders clinging to Vienna to being masters of a huge new empire sprawling across Central and Southeastern Europe. The family that had once been the guardians of a Spanish and Atlantic world reinvented itself entirely as a Central European power, a Danube empire, stitched together out of the lands they had defended and the lands they had reconquered. And what they stitched together was unlike almost anything else in Europe. Look at what the Austrian Habsburgs now ruled by the height of their power. Germans in the Austrian heartland, Hungarians on the Great Plains to the east, Czechs in Bohemia, Poles and Ukrainians in the northern provinces, Croats, Slovenes, Serbs and Italians in the south, Romanians in Transylvania, Slovaks in the mountains. More than a dozen distinct peoples, speaking more than a dozen languages, worshipping in different churches, remembering different histories, jammed together under one crown. There was no common tongue that everyone spoke. There was no shared national feeling, no sense of a single people. What held this astonishing patchwork together was not blood, not language, not nationhood. It was the crown, the dynasty, and a vast apparatus of paperwork. The Habsburg Empire ran on bureaucracy the way a body runs on blood, an enormous, methodical army of officials, clerks, and administrators, moving documents from desk to desk, collecting taxes, drafting soldiers, and keeping records in a controlled, orderly flood of paper that reached from the imperial palace down into the smallest provincial village. Loyalty was owed not to a nation, but to the emperor. You were not asked to be German or Hungarian or Czech. You were asked to be a faithful subject of the House of Habsburg. Picture a company where the employees speak 12 different languages, come from 12 different backgrounds, and share nothing in common except that they all draw a paycheck signed by the same name at the top. And that name is the only thing keeping the whole enterprise from flying apart. For a long time, remarkably, it worked. A dozen peoples who might otherwise have been at each other's throats lived together, more or less, under a single ancient dynasty, and the empire endured while flashier kingdoms rose and fell around it. But there was a contradiction buried at the very heart of the arrangement, quiet and patient, and it went like this. The entire empire was built on the premise that it did not matter what nation you belonged to, that a Croat and a Czech and a German were all simply subjects of the same emperor, and their language and their people were beside the point. The whole machine assumed that loyalty to a dynasty could always outweigh loyalty to a people. And for centuries, there had been no serious reason to question that assumption, because the idea that a people, a nation defined by language and blood and shared history, should have its own state, should rule itself, was not yet loose in the world. That idea was coming. It was gathering out on the horizon like weather, in the writings of philosophers and the songs of poets, and the grievances of peoples who were beginning, for the very first time, to ask a dangerous question. Not, who is my emperor, but who are my people? And it would strike this beautiful, improbable, 1,000-year mosaic of a dynasty at the exact point where it was weakest, the seam between the crown and the peoples it ruled. The dangerous question was already loose by the time the 19th century arrived, and once a people starts asking it, who are we, and why do we answer to a foreign crown, you cannot make them un-ask it. That was the poison seeping into the Habsburg machine. For 600 years, the empire's genius had been its indifference to nationality. You could be Czech or Croat or Hungarian. The emperor did not care, as long as you paid your taxes and obeyed the paperwork. But now, a new and intoxicating idea was spreading across Europe like a fever, that a people, defined by its language and its history, deserved to govern itself. That the natural unit of the world was not the dynasty, but the nation. For the Habsburgs, this idea was not just inconvenient, it was lethal, because it attacked the one thing holding the whole empire together. If loyalty was supposed to flow to your nation rather than to your emperor, then an empire of a dozen nations was not a home. it was a prison. And across the empire, one people after another began to feel exactly that. Hungarians rose in open revolt in the middle of the century, declared their independence, and had to be crushed. And the Habsburgs only managed it by begging a Russian army to march in and do the bloody work for them. Imagine the humiliation. An empire so shaken by one of its own peoples that it had to call in a foreign power to hold itself together. That was the shape of things to come. The Habsburgs tried to patch it. They cut a deal with the Hungarians, splitting the empire into two halves, Austria and Hungary, sharing one monarch. A clever, exhausting compromise that bought decades of peace and solved nothing. Because the moment you gave the Hungarians their own half, every other people in the empire wanted the same. The Czechs wanted it. The Croats and the Serbs and the Poles and the Romanians all wanted it. You cannot give one child the biggest slice and expect the rest to stop staring at the knife. The old machine, built to be blind to nationality, was now surrounded by peoples who could think of nothing else. And through it all, holding the whole impossible contraption together by sheer endurance, was one old man. Franz Joseph came to the throne as a teenager in the middle of that revolutionary chaos, and then simply refused to die for the next 68 years. Sit with that number. He was crowned when much of Europe still moved by horse and sailing ship, and he was still on the throne when airplanes were dropping bombs and machine guns were mowing men down in trenches. He outlived his own era so completely that by the end, he was less a ruler than a relic, a living link to a vanished world, the last human embodiment of the ancient idea that a dynasty could stand above nations. He was, by every account, a machine of duty. He rose before dawn, worked at his desk for hours, slept on a plain iron camp bed like a soldier, and buried himself in the endless flood of paperwork that was the empire's lifeblood. He was the perfect bureaucrat king for a bureaucrat empire, signing documents until his eyes failed. But the world he was so faithfully administering was dissolving under his pen, and his own family became a kind of grim theater of the empire's decline. The tragedies came one after another, and they were the stuff of nightmares. His only son, the crown prince, the heir on whom the entire future of the dynasty rested, was found dead in a hunting lodge with his young mistress, in what the evidence points to as a murder-suicide. In a single morning, the direct line of succession simply ended. Then his wife, the famously beautiful and famously unhappy empress, who had spent decades wandering Europe to escape the suffocating rigidity of the Vienna court, was stabbed to death on a lakeside promenade by an anarchist who had wanted to kill any royal he could find and picked her almost at random. His brother, sent off to be Emperor of Mexico in a doomed foreign adventure, was captured and shot by a firing squad. Wife murdered, son a suicide, brother executed by firing squad. Heir after heir cut down. This old man outlived nearly everyone he loved, and the empire watched him do it. And the two stories, the dying family and the dying empire, became impossible to separate. He was photographed in his later years as a stooped figure with immense white side whiskers, alone, formal, unbearably tired, and he had become the perfect symbol of what he ruled, something very old, very dignified, held together only by the refusal to admit that its time was over. After his son's death, the crown passed sideways to a nephew, a difficult, stubborn man who did not much like the empire he was going to inherit and had plans to shake it up, perhaps by giving the empire's Slavic peoples a bigger share of power. That plan terrified the empire's enemies, especially the fierce nationalists in neighboring Serbia, who dreamed of pulling the empire's southern Slavs out to form their own great nation, and feared that a reformed, more generous Habsburg Empire might steal that dream away. So when this heir announced he would visit the recently annexed province of Bosnia and its capital, a cluster of young Serbian nationalists, armed and coached by a shadowy network across the border, decided he would not leave the city alive. The day it happened is one of the strangest in the whole history of the continent, because it very nearly did not happen at all. The first assassin threw a bomb at the heir's open car. It bounced off and exploded behind him, wounding others but leaving him unharmed. The plot appeared to have failed completely. The assassins scattered in despair, one of them stopping at a cafe, giving up entirely. The heir, shaken but alive, went ahead with an official reception, then decided to visit the wounded in the hospital. But nobody clearly told his driver the route had changed. The driver took a wrong turn, realized his mistake, and stopped the car to reverse, directly in front of the very cafe where one of the assassins happened to be standing, a few feet away. 2 shots, that was all. One struck the heir in the neck, the other struck his wife, who was traveling beside him. Within minutes, both were dead. An empire of 50 million people had just been shoved toward the edge of a cliff by a wrong turn, a stalled car, and a 19-year-old with a pistol who could not believe his luck. If the driver had known the route, the 20th century as we know it might not exist. It is almost unbearable to think about how much hinged on so little. The old emperor in Vienna, who had endured so much death already, reportedly received the news with a grim, weary resignation. He had never been close to this difficult nephew, but the men around him, the generals and ministers who had long wanted a reason to crush Serbia once and for all, saw not a family tragedy, but an opportunity. And this is where a personal wound metastasized into a continental catastrophe. The empire sent Serbia an ultimatum so harsh, so deliberately impossible, that it was designed to be rejected. A list of demands that would have effectively ended Serbia's existence as an independent country. To general astonishment, Serbia accepted nearly all of it, agreeing to almost everything, balking at only the single point that would have let Austrian officials run their own investigation on Serbian soil. It was very nearly total surrender. It did not matter. The men who wanted war had already decided. The empire declared war on Serbia anyway, and then the machinery of alliances that had been tightening across Europe for decades did exactly what everyone feared it would. Russia stood behind Serbia. Germany stood behind Austria. France stood with Russia. Britain came in over Belgium. Within weeks, 2 shots fired at a stalled car in a Balkan side street had dragged the entire continent into the deadliest war it had ever seen. The Habsburgs, who for 600 years had specialized in avoiding war by getting married, ended by stumbling into the war that would destroy them. The war they had wanted turned on them almost immediately. Their armies, hurled against Serbia and against Russia, were shattered in the opening campaigns. The empire's great weakness now became fatal. It was an army of a dozen peoples, and an order shouted in German meant nothing to a Czech or a Ruthenian conscript who did not want to die for an emperor he had never met. As the war ground on into its 3rd and 4th years, the whole structure began to come apart from the inside. The hunger came first. The empire could not feed itself. In Vienna, the imperial capital, the seat of 6 centuries of Habsburg glory, people were starving in the streets, queuing for hours for scraps of bread, boiling anything they could find. The paperwork empire, the great bureaucratic body that ran on the orderly flow of documents and grain and loyalty, was bleeding out. And the old emperor, the last human keystone, finally died in the middle of the war, in his 80s, at his desk, working almost to the end. With him went the one thread of loyalty that had bound the peoples together, not to a nation, but to that one ancient, exhausted man. His grandnephew, a young man in his 20s who had never expected the throne, inherited a crown that was already crumbling in his hands. The end came with astonishing speed. As the war collapsed in its final autumn, the empire's people simply stopped waiting for permission. They did not need to storm the palace. They did not need a great battle. The Czechs declared their own state. The Hungarians declared theirs. The southern Slavs broke away to join a new kingdom that would become Yugoslavia. The Poles reached out to their kin. Province after province, people after people, simply walked out the door. The machine that had run on loyalty to the crown discovered that the loyalty had quietly evaporated. And once it was gone, there was nothing left holding the walls up. An empire of 50 million people did not fall. It dissolved. The way that sandcastle finally gives way, not to a great wave, but to the water quietly pulling the sand out from underneath, until there is simply nothing there. The young last emperor did something that had almost no precedent. He refused to formally abdicate, refused to say the words that would end the dynasty. Instead, he issued a careful statement, renouncing any part in the affairs of state, hoping, perhaps, that if he never actually resigned, the family might somehow return one day. It was a fragile, human hope, and it changed nothing. He and his family slipped out of the palace, and the new republic that rose in Austria's place had no intention of letting them stay. He was sent into exile, and later, when he made desperate attempts to reclaim at least his Hungarian throne, he was captured and deported to a remote island in the Atlantic, thousands of miles from the lands his family had ruled for 600 years. He died there a couple of years later, in his 30s, of pneumonia, poor and half forgotten, on an island most of his former subjects could not have found on a map. The heir to Charles's world empire, buried on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. And that is the thing that stays with me about this whole story. 600 years of patient assembly, marriage by marriage, death by death, crown by crown. The most improbable empire in European history, built without ever really needing to win a war. And it was undone not by a superior army, not by a rival dynasty, not by any of the forces the Habsburgs had spent centuries learning to outmaneuver at the wedding altar. It was undone by an idea that had not even existed when the family began. The simple, unstoppable notion that a people should belong to itself. Charles had discovered the truth of it 400 years earlier, wearing himself to death, fighting a religious idea he could not defeat with any army. His descendants learned the same lesson in the harshest possible way. You cannot marry an idea, and you cannot execute it, and you cannot outlast it. It waits, it spreads, and in the end, it walks quietly out the door and takes 50 million people with it. There is a version of this story where the empire's great strategy looks like genius, and a version where it looks like a slow-motion trap. A family so good at inheriting the world that it never learned to give the peoples of that world a reason to stay. Both versions are true at once, and that is what makes it one of the strangest, saddest, most human stories in all of history. An entire civilization of paper and loyalty and ancient crowns, gone in the span of a single lifetime, leaving behind an empty throne in a quiet palace in Vienna, and a silence where 600 years used to be. If this is the kind of history you want to keep discovering, the deep, human machinery beneath the dates and the maps, then subscribe and stay with this channel. because there are 100 more stories like this one waiting. Each one a whole vanished world of its own.